Wolfgang Münchau, welcome to the podcast.
Joshua, thank you for the invitation.
I've been a fan of your work and writing for a long time, but the occasion to have you on is your latest book by the lovely German word that is also understandable in English of Kaput. You're arguing that Germany's economic and perhaps Germany's political model is really at an unprecedented inflection point in an unprecedented crisis in the last decades. Before we get into why that is and what can be done about it, what's the case for Germany being in as severe a crisis as you're saying the country is?
Germany had a model that was based on an economic model to which the entire country adheres to, from the left and the right, which is about industrial exports. And in fact, it has become a model of industrial export surpluses. These two are not the same thing. Generating very large export surpluses with the rest of the world. And this economic model has influenced German foreign policy. It is responsible for its relationship with Russia, for its relationship with China. It's also responsible for its energy policy, its dependency on Russian gas, its decision also to lightheartedly to get rid of nuclear because it had that backup arrangement going with Putin. So it is a model that was, that's been basically in operational for in different disguises since the Second World War, but in its latest disguise, this Russian energy-based phase, that the phase that relies heavily on engineering, on industry. That's I'd say, I date this back to about 2000. And it started with Schröder, it was continued under Merkel and continued under Scholz. And, if you look at the debate today, there isn't anybody who questions this model. The debate is about who can run it better. But if you look at it from the outside, and, I'm a German who's looking at this from the outside, and sometimes when you look at these from the outside, it looks a little different than when you're discussing it from the inside. What it appears to me is that this model, which is very much based on 1980s, 1990s technologies, is no longer working in the 2020s. Now, Germany is, for me, the symbol is the car, because that's the biggest industry in Germany, and the German car. 20 years ago, when Germany had a crisis, they fixed it through competitiveness measures, making the labor market a bit more liberal and reducing subsistence wages and all that.
And what's interesting about the difference between those two crises we made button for a second is that at the time, labor costs had gotten very high and there were other countries that could compete on cost. But German car makers still had a real technological lead, right? So as I understand it, part of the reason why the car industry is in crisis today is not just that you can produce it more cheaply in other more developing countries around the world, but that it's really no longer clear that the German car brands have the allure and the technological innovation that they once did.
That's right. Cost is a factor. I don't want to say it's not a factor at all, because the cars that are produced in Germany are too expensive. And but these car companies have factories everywhere in the world these days, so they can branch out. They get their parts from everywhere in the world. So the potential for cost reduction. VW has some potential for cost reduction, but the other car companies are running pretty lean machines. But as you said, the cars are no longer what they used to be. The electric cars, German electric cars, are absolutely rubbish. I can say this with this extreme blanket comment because they have not invested in. They don't own the battery technology, and they're nowhere in software. And this is the Germans are at the moment focused and paranoid about batteries. They invested in batteries. They put in a lot of subsidies into battery joint ventures. Virtually all of them have failed. Northvolt, which was a Swedish company that has just gone into bankruptcy. The Mercedes Stellantis venture on batteries isn't going anywhere. But the real thing which worries me is the software, because this is where Germans are taking no interest, because they've kind of not invested in digital technologies at all. So
and just as a point of an illustration here, I believe, I may be wrong about this, but still the technology company with by far the biggest market capitalization in Germany is SAP, which was founded in 1972.
That's right. SAP is, is an oldie among the digital technology companies. They done very well. They got into the business software market, and they run basically completely integrated, business software for companies, from accountancy to stock management, and everything hangs together, and they maintained that niche for a long time. So no, this is a successful company, but it's an oldie of a successful company. It's not as dynamic as Google or Amazon or Facebook or any Meta for any of these. It's a different generation.
I don't think that the Silicon Valley, that the big tech companies in Silicon Valley are fearing the innovativeness of SAP.
No, definitely not. It's a first generation digital giant, but I think we're now in the third generation, and this is now it's a different. Nothing comes from Germany in that respect, but the car industry is nowhere on AI and the self-driving car, and that's where the big money will be in 10 years' time. This is where they will make the money. And I see this industry, the German industry will probably end up as the junior partner of Tesla or the Chinese, because they don't have the capacity to innovate. And this is where the problem is. And there's no savings program in the world that can make you innovate. It's the contrary. They need to invest to innovate. And that's something that Germans have kind of forgotten. And that's what saving surplus. If you look at it economically, if you run surpluses, export surpluses, that's a saving surpluses. That means you save more than you invest. Germans have been investing outside of Germany. That's what happened. VW built factories in China. So they built a cluster risk because they created factories in exactly the same sector that they're already engaged in. They didn't invest in other stuff, which could have kind of shielded them against their own mistakes. And we are basically in this scenario where they are underinvested, and therefore kind of falling behind as a result of underinvestment, most of which is in the private sector.
Well, so let me put a question to you here. You, I believe, are somebody who's more rooted in what Germans would call Volkswirtschaftslehre, which roughly is the equivalent of macroeconomics. There's also Betriebswirtschaftslehre, which is really more about the economics of business. That's I think, less perfect analogy to something like macroeconomics. I feel like the two explanations for the crisis of the German car industry that would be drawn from those different modes of looking at the world are a little bit different, right? So one story here is to say Germany has an economic model that is so based on experts that it over-indexes both in foreign policy and in the behavior of companies on trying to do that. And, this has a cultural dimension because Germany has seen itself for a long time as an Export-Weltmeister, as the world champion in exports, which I believe it no longer is, but was for a while, and it was a kind of displacement patriotism for the country as well. And so one story you can tell is that, that led German industry and German politics to make the wrong bets, to bet on cheap gas from Russia or to bet on exports to China, and those bets went wrong. I have a lot of sympathy for that story. I think somebody who wants to push back might say, well, what about the BWL side of this? What about the business economic side of this? Don't we see in all kinds of industries that incumbents find it very hard to innovate? That Kodak has, a very dominant business in photography, but because they are so strong in the traditional world of analog photography, it is just really hard, for reasons of the internal structure of big corporations, for them to also take the lead on digital technology. And so once we move to digital photography, Kodak goes belly up. And, isn't it unfortunate that Germany is hit by exactly that kind of development? That, of course, for these reasons that are not to do with the sort of Germany's self-conception as an export, world champion and all of those things. It's just BMW and Volkswagen were never going to be the leaders on electric vehicles. It was always going to be newcomers to the market, as was the case.
No, I completely agree with you that existing companies in one technology are not leading in the. I give the example in my book on Smith Corona, which was a typewriter manufacturer in the United States, which actually managed to integrate digital technologies in its typewriters quite successfully, and it peaked in, I think, in 1989 when the PC had long been invented, and only a few years later it was the laser printer that killed them. The problem in Germany, I completely agree that, I would not expect VW and BMW to be the champions of the world of electric cars, because it's just generally not the case. Just as newspapers are not the owners of social media. And it's the same. You see this in many examples, that once traditional media companies didn't see this. They didn't understand this. The logic of the business model, everything they believed in, everything they were educated and trained in, had been turned upside down in the social media. So it's clear that other people got there first. The problem with Germany is that Germany did not allow these other companies to come up. Now, I'm not saying that VW should have done this, but Germany as a country has the resources to, it has got good people, it's got good schools, good universities. There are lots of successful Germans out in the world, but Germany has not created. I mean, you mentioned SAP. Why aren't there more SAPs? Why aren't there any SAPs in the car sector? It's not a lack of people. It's not a lack of educated people. It's a question of groupthink. And the German model was premised on the idea that if something gets invented, it gets invented by Volkswagen. And the subsidy system, the way the EU, funding, investment projects work, these things always end up with the car industry, always end up with existing companies. There isn't a capital market that would give venture capital to startups. They have startups. It's gotten a little better. But they don't have a private equity market that would take a little startup up to the stock market level. This route is blocked. This is not a country for entrepreneurs, and this is to do with costs, to do with taxes, to do with bureaucracy, but also cultural. And I completely, I agree with your description that we should talk about cultural, because it's not that cool in Germany to be an entrepreneur, and the society doesn't reward you. It doesn't reward failure. It's not when you fail, you get bankrupt, you get brand marked, you can never do anything in your life. It's a very different culture. And this is not a culture where, if you're in the EU and you basically face a broadly level playing field and you wanted to set up a company, I would not do this in Germany. If you can avoid this, you go to Luxembourg or Belgium. They're much business friendly, and most of them are much business friendly. I wouldn't go to France either, but the Baltic republics of Finland are incredibly business friendly. So it's not just a comment on the EU. The EU is actually getting worse in one respect. It has passed a lot of legislation that makes life very difficult for especially for people operating in the digital world. The data protection in Europe is on a different planet. It's off the charts. And the Digital Services Act, we see this problem now the EU has with Elon Musk and with Mark Zuckerberg. It's about content moderation. The EU law forces any social media owner to implement content moderation, and both Musk and Zuckerberg are now defying this EU law and hoping that Trump will bully the EU into compliance with American interests. But this is where the EU is Germany is sort of the leader of this. The German decline isn't an EU decline yet, but it is going to be an EU decline in the years ahead, because Germany has influenced EU policy to a very, very significant extent.
So let's talk about this broader lack of innovation, because I think you're right in your response to my point, which is that, sure, perhaps it shouldn't have been Volkswagen or BMW, but why couldn't it have been a different company in Germany to take the lead on some of these electric vehicles or some of these other kinds of inventions? I believe that Angela Merkel, to her credit, was obsessed, I read this in one of the biographies of her, with the fact that there's no billion-dollar patents coming out of Germany, that Germany had all kinds of smaller patents, many of it small, medium businesses making innovations that are value-creating and significant, but very few that make innovations that really can create a large new company, a new branch of industry, something that really is transformative in that kind of way. It's not clear to me that she did very much about that while she was chancellor, but at least she seems to have been aware of that problem. It seems to me that the roots of that really go quite deep. as you're saying, it's not a business-friendly culture. I mean, I grew up in a kind of cultural milieu in Germany. My mother is a conductor. It would never have occurred to me that founding a company was within the realm of something I should do or I could do. I mean, I wouldn't have known the beginnings of where to turn with assistance or advice on how to do such an undertaking. It was just completely outside of a realm of my social milieu. No, there's obviously other social milieus in Germany that are much more entrepreneurial. There's many, many companies in Germany. But I think that's kind of indicative of something interesting. There is a problem with universities, I would argue, in Germany. There's many decent universities in Germany. There's, for various historical reasons, no truly excellent German university that can compete with the Harvards and the Stanfords or the Cambridges or the Oxfords of the world, or for that matter, increasingly with Tsinghua or Beijing University or other leading universities around the world. There is bureaucratic obstacles to innovation. And then, of course, as a result of all of that, you don't have a capital, right? I mean, you don't have the VC firms that are willing to place big bets on companies that, might have a very big payoff. I spoke to somebody who was thinking of founding a startup in various places in Europe and ended up going to the United States, who said, well, in Europe I could have 100,000 euros of seed funding for 25 to 50% of my company. In the States, I can get $1 million for 5 or 10%. The incentives really aren't there. And then, of course, there's large problems with how startups and so on are taxed. If you look at all of that, it feels like it would take just a real, I don't like the word very much, but a kind of revolution in social attitudes. But it seems to me as though Germany is still very, very far away from that. I mean, the country is starting to talk about some of these problems, and your book is a contribution to that. But the solutions that are discussed are really at the margins. I'm not an accelerationist, but is this one of the situations where things will have to get a lot worse for the country to actually be willing to undertake the radical reforms it takes to fix some of these issues?
Yeah. I completely agree with your analysis. The problems are very deep, cultural, and they're entirely system-wide. I mean, there are labor market situations. And when I was editing the Financial Times Deutschland in Germany, I was one of the founders of that newspaper in the year 2000. And we realized one of the first things that happened, and that was a company upstart. We were slightly, well funded. We had sort of big companies behind us. But one of the first things that happened to us was like we had a works council. And, we suddenly had, within a very short time, we were sort of the startup challenger to the existing media landscape. And suddenly we found ourselves with the same structures, the same conservatism that all our competitors had as well. I'm wary of the argument that it has to get worse. I used to say this about the euro and the eurozone. So I wrote a lot about this subject, as a newspaper columnist, and we always used to say it's got to get really bad for Germany to accept that the EU needed a political dimension and that needed to set up a fiscal union so that the eurozone, the monetary union, would be complemented by sort of, it had a political, it would be embedded in a broader political force, and they fudged it over. The central bank gave a bailout. The whole thing was never resolved, but they were still breathing, that was an example of it got really bad, but it wasn't resolved. And there is the ability of European politicians, and Merkel in particular, to kick the can down the road was just legendary. And, I completely agree with you. Merkel is a very smart, very intelligent woman, a very intelligent politician, probably the most intelligent politician who has been sort of run in charge of Germany probably since Helmut Schmidt, in terms of her ability to understand, other leaders, deep cultural understanding of other cultures, and a sharp analysis, a sharp mind. I think her point about the 1 trillion or the billion startups is completely correct. And yet she didn't do anything about it. Her policies in that direction were just very, very poor, and very superficial. she wasn't interested in it. She had other priorities. So that there are these two minds of her. She was a PhD physicist, so she understood technology. This was not the issue here. But I don't think the idea that it has to get worse. Maybe if it got really bad, that people were saying, but there is an awful lot of resistance in Germany, resistance to change. It's a rich country. I remember I'm following discussion in Germany about, the country is obsessed with Elon Musk because Musk does something that no German businessman would ever do, take on the establishment, endorse a party that's complete, a party that nobody would want to be associated with. The AfD is a party of the far right. He would say things that nobody would say. He calls the chancellor a fool. He is, he's extremely daring, and this is something, where in the context of his discussion about, or in the DOGE, the leadership, the Department of Government Efficiency that's about to be launched in the United States, the head of the German Civil Servants Union was asked whether something like this could happen in Germany, and he says, "No, we don't want this kind of thing. We don't want change. We don't want to change the way we work." And Germany is the least.
There's an old joke about Oxford Dons. How many Oxford Dons does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is change, which naturally also applies to German civil servants. Absolutely. And perhaps German politicians.
Yes, I think that's right. And we have basically, the German political system. If you look at the German elections, you can describe this pretty squarely with a game of musical chairs. You have four parties if you take the CDU and CSU as one party. You have four centrist parties. You have three chairs. And at the end of the elections, three of them will be sitting in chairs and the other one will be the opposition party. And that's basically the way the election. The same parties will always be in coalitions. There is now very deep unhappiness with the current government, the so-called traffic light coalition between the Social Democrats, Free Democrats, and the Greens. But at least one of them will end up in government. That is an almost certain prediction to make. I don't have to make any sort of daring poll projections. It's very difficult to assume that the CDU would have a majority of its own, or the CDU and the FDP would have a majority of its own, or someone would form a minority government, or that somebody goes completely outside of the system. They have firewalls, and this is very protective. And there's an awful lot of in the German language that's very protective. We have a firewall against the AfD, the party of the right, because we want to protect democracy. We want to protect ourselves against Elon Musk's X and the fake news that it generates. It's a lot of protectionism. Whereas in America, the attitude is, there's fake news. Then if there's fake news, I'll read something else. People take this less, are less so fearful of the world, and I get a sense that the 21st century and Germany, that doesn't go well together.
Well, the 20th century in Germany didn't always go well together either. Let me. I want to get back to the political question, because there's an election that is coming up, and I would love to explain the nature and the stakes, and perhaps the lack of stakes in that election to our readers from your mouth. But let's double down for a moment on this question of change. So I have one response to what you were saying, which is that I constitutionally am deeply aware of the fact that the worst that can happen in the world and in politics is much more significant than the best you might achieve. So on normative grounds, I am in virtually no situation an accelerationist. I think that this desire for things to get worse so that they can get better is nearly always a normative mistake. In purely empirical terms, I guess I would distinguish between two different things, which is one, the only circumstances under which things would change is if things get a lot worse. And two, it may be that things get a lot worse and they still won't change and they still won't improve, and then we get into an even worse crisis. And that's the reason why we shouldn't hope for that. But I guess what you said convinced me that if things get worse, that may not be enough for Germany to take the steps it should to reform itself. But it didn't really convince me that there's any realistic chance of Germany reforming itself unless things get worse. Again, I think my upshot of that is that I'd rather things don't get worse and we somehow manage to tuck along without those reforms than that it get worse and we gamble on them being able to reform. But just in terms of predictions, I would make that distinction. The other point I wanted to make, or question I wanted to ask you, is about what a real deterioration would look like. As you're saying, Germany is still a very affluent country. It's a country in which, yes, the trains no longer run on time. Yes, there's some general problems with infrastructure, but you go to Germany and it's clearly a functional country in which most people live lives of a pretty high quality in terms of their material well-being and also in terms of other kinds of indicators. It's remarkable that the German stock exchange is at record highs, despite, I think, the rightful fear that you and others have for the long-term likely success of some of its most heavily capitalized companies. And yet the DAX closed the year, at a record high. What would it look like for things to really go off the rails? I mean, if Volkswagen went bankrupt, if the car industry really just left Germany in the way it left Britain a number of decades ago, what would it take for the country to become the sick man of Europe in a more profound way than it did, 20, 25 years ago when Germany was going through some period of economic stagnation?
When we discuss decline, and then there's always this question of how does it end? Does it have to get worse, or is there going to be reform? Often in life, the most plausible or the most likely way of how decline happens is for decline simply to happen. It might just not be resolved. And we both understand the obstacles to it. We understand the social preference and the political preferences. And while we probably would like to change it, and if we can enforce it, but it's not going to happen. So the decline, you can basically say it's gradually and then suddenly. That would be the way these things work. This has gone on for almost 10 years. I saw the first, the German industry started to stagnate pretty shortly after Brexit, the Brexit referendum in 2016. That's when industry lost a big kind of, they didn't lose the export market, but Britain was no longer integrated in the supply chains. People started to divest out of Britain because it wasn't the future. And that was a blow to German industry. Then came the pandemic, then came Russia, there came various dependencies, the whole supply chain optimization that they worked on for 20 years is kind of no longer worked because people realized that it was too risky. So they needed to have some more slack in the supply chain in order to be able to function during a crisis. Then came Russia's invasion and drove the energy prices up. And now comes Trump, who imposes tariffs and makes all sorts of threats to Europe. So this has been one crisis after another, and maybe this will, the sequence of events will probably not continue in quite the same way. But Germany does have an investment crisis and a competitiveness crisis that will simply continue. The cars won't be, they won't sell in Germany. In Volkswagen, Volkswagen wanted to close 3 factories. This was the announcement, and then the government and the trade unions they basically leaned on them not to do this. So they cut a deal with the classic German deal. The unions, get a bit less money, and everything is sort of done in complete consensus. But this is, it's hard to see how this deal will resolve the company's deep fundamental innovation problem. And I don't think it matters whether Volkswagen produces something in Wolfsburg or whether it produces it in Slovakia. What it does matter is that the company doesn't know how to. The company can't, or is not even interested in the sort of the cutting edge software technology. It does software. It pretends it's a software company, but I've never heard a German car boss, saying anything intelligent about AI, engaging with sort of 21st century themes in the way Musk does, in the way other tech leaders do in the world. And this is something which leads me to believe is that there will be subsidies. They will try everything. They will absolutely try everything. There will be joint ventures. There will be tariffs. you can drag this out a bit. You can postpone the 2035 target for the end of the fuel-driven car. You can put that to 2040, and that might happen. Germany is very influential, and the supply chain of the German car industry is substantial enough for the Germans to push this through the EU. So I think there will be a long period of denial and of trying to stem against it, of trying to do everything except solve the problem, which is obviously to start innovating and start creating conditions for companies. The only party that even verbally supports, what you and I have been talking about, is the FDP. Now, the problem with the FDP is that it only verbally supports this when in opposition or when not in government. When in government, the FDP has never done any of these things. It has never. Christian Lindner campaigned last time as a champion of small industry, of entrepreneurs. There are lots of photographs with him with young business people and startup companies. But in government, what did he do? He spent his entire political capital, on getting an exemption for Porsche from the emissions guidelines from the EU, and on the debt brake, which is the fiscal rule that Germany had. In practice, the FDP, even the FDP, which is the most free market of the parties, cannot talk about this anymore. Has not gotten the language, and if nobody talks about this, and it's nobody's theme, then it's not going to happen. It's as simple as that. I mean, I don't have to. I write the book, and I've got letters from friends, friends in Germany who were saying, "Oh my God, this is completely what we need. What needs to happen." And there was a lot of enthusiasm among a very small group of people who see it like I do. But I'm under no illusion about how this will catch on, because it won't. I'll see whether the book will do well in Germany. That will be an interesting test. But but more important than that is whether anyone will debate this. And I don't see this happening. So to answer, I haven't answered your question yet, but let me just try to chart what's going to happen. So let's have the election. Let's assume the polls are roughly right. Friedrich Merz will become chancellor, form a coalition, whatever, with the SPD maybe. And there will be some changes, some cosmetic change, some competitive stuff, the stuff they always do, and then they realize they still have this problem, and that they're still not they're falling further behind the Chinese and the Americans, and then the AfD will probably then by the next election have 30%, will be the largest party, and it will then no longer be possible, politically possible, to form a government without it. As just happened in Austria, where the centrist parties, the old parties, very similar to the Germans, they have basically one-to-one equivalents, where they could no longer form a government. And I would expect the same thing that happened in Austria just a few weeks ago, in fact, a few days ago, to happen in Germany in 4 years' time. And then there will be a sort of a right-wing government, and it will, things will get really bad at that point. And then it can go off in many, many directions. And maybe there is some kind of centrist revolutionary Macron-type figure who's unlike Macron, who's actually getting the job done, or whether this just sinks in complete sort of populism and nostalgia. Because the AfD, the main characteristic of both the AfD and the parties of the left is not that they are particularly extremist or right wing or left wing. It is that they're also wedded to the old system more than anybody else. I mean, they wanted more steel companies. I don't think that Elon Musk knows whom he was endorsing. If he had spent 10 minutes, he would have seen this is the least tech-friendly party in Germany. So this will be a long route until something happens, and I can't really look beyond 2030.
So let's switch to the politics, and I think some of my American listeners may have gotten a little bit lost with the mentions of various German politicians, political parties, and so on. And I want to, with the elections coming up, give an overview of the German political system and so on. But before we get into those details, I wonder whether there is certainly a political sense in which Germany has learned the wrong lessons from the last 60 years, but perhaps even a broader intellectual sense in which Germany has learned the wrong lessons from the last 60 years. Germany went through the cataclysm of World War II, and its political leaders after 1945 had the wisdom and the foresight of integrating Germany clearly into the Western alliance, making it at first imperfect but genuine democracy that became freer over time. And from very early on, the greatest desire that the political leadership of a country had, but that also ordinary citizens had, very understandably, was for stability in light of what had happened for the previous 15 years and the previous 50 years. And so Konrad Adenauer, the very influential German post-war chancellor, won, I believe, a couple of elections on the slogan "Keine Experimente," no experiments. And it feels to me that this has come to be the basic shared outlook of all of the establishment parties in Germany, not only of the conservatives, of the Christian Democrats, who are the most explicitly mostly conservative, but of the Social Democrats, and in certain ways of the Greens as well. And that makes it very, very hard for a country to change its model when its basic attitude to the world is the least responsible thing in the world is to have a strong opinion and to say we have to change a bunch of things. Those are only kind of weirdos or radicals. To become a member of a German establishment, you have to have a good sense to say no to all of those kinds of things. And then it starts to inflect an intellectual culture as well. I mean, it strikes me that the German public sphere is much less argumentative, much less opinion-driven, has a much narrower range of voices than the public sphere in England or the United States, or in different ways, even in a country like France. Now, that has some compensating benefits, right? It means that, we don't have a Marjorie Taylor Greene, and, we don't have, some of the sillier woke ideas have as much influence in Germany as it does in other countries and so on. But it also just makes it really, really hard to grapple with a kind of caesura that Germany is living through at the moment in terms of its economic and political model.
The trouble with consensus societies like Germany is that when the consensus is wrong, you don't have corrective forces. And that's, you have this in the United States. I mean, correction, shifts in politics almost happen unexpectedly. You think there is a consensus in one direction, suddenly, Donald Trump wins an election and things go off in a very different direction. That doesn't happen in Germany. If you look at why the car industry, just take that example again, why it failed is because the entire industry believed in what it believed in, and the government believed in what it believed in. There wasn't any, Elon Musk who says, I'll do something different. I'll test the model. And because he would have been laughed out of court, he would have been, the media would have ganged up against him. The whole system as a whole. This is what the consensus system is. It isn't just companies, it's everybody. It's the entire intellectual and commercial climate that is behind it. And this is why the German model, I completely agree with you. Stability was for the generation of my parents, it was the main thing. The idea that, the idea of what's sort of happening now would have been very, very alienating to them. And they would not have expected that to happen. But what is stability? I'm a big fan of the political economist Matthew Olson, who in the 1960s predicted or analyzed the success of Japan and Germany. And he said that these societies actually benefited from having lost the war because that allowed them to completely regenerate themselves. The reason why the UK back in those days was stagnant was very much it had won the war, it had not innovated, and we had basically the very opposite of what we have today. And that's a force of how things change, and this would sort of be the things have to get really bad until something changes. And I don't think things will get that bad. And decline can happen. I mean, people use this frog in the water type argument, but decline can happen slowly and gradually. This is how industrial decline happens. Industries don't just go away. they just reduce their output. There's going to be an investment somewhere else, and there are going to be some job cuts. This will take 10 years until they're down. And there will be no sort of dramatic moment until this happens. And then one day they will wake up and they will realize things decline. If you're rich and they still have their pensions, they still have their places to live. They have rent controls. Life is pretty affordable in Germany. They just be poorer. They want to afford cars. The cars will become cheaper. There will be Chinese cars. They go on public transport if it still runs. People save and people become poorer. That's essentially how it happens. And if you're starting from a high level, as Germany does, it can take a long time.
I think that's a really helpful model. So the likely future of Germany is not Argentina or Venezuela; it's Italy or Japan.
Yeah, exactly. Much more likely. I'm actually speaking to you from Italy, where I spend quite a bit of my time, and it's Italy's been. It started in Italy in 2000. When they joined the euro, this is when Italy's declined, because they had industries that were very susceptible to what China did back then. They imitated, fashion, and Italy had a lot of businesses that were kind of copied by China, and they were affected very early on when Germany was still running very strong. And Italy has had virtually zero productivity growth since it joined the euro 25 years ago. Now, Italy, unlike Germany, has been better with digital technology. People have much better phone systems here. They have digital administration, so they can file their taxes digitally. They can't do that in Germany, and they're a bit more flexible. They don't have these bureaucratic attitudes. It's I wouldn't say it's a can-do country, but people are much more sort of, I'd say, pragmatic about things. Whereas Germany has become a little bit phlegmatic and bureaucratic, and also it leads to the adverse, selection in companies. The leaders are not the best entrepreneurs. The leaders are the ones who know how to fill out forms and who know how to call at the European Commission, who have connection with the government, who play the political game much better. This is an important part of success in German business. Whereas that's not what makes you succeed on markets. And this is so things are developing in the wrong direction, and kind of the good people are no longer there, and they go elsewhere. And Germany has a brain drain problem, as well as a problem of attracting the right people coming into it, as you said about universities. It's quite absurd. I mean, I've tried this in our own family, getting one of my children to study in Germany, having been to school in the UK, and it became the process, even for a German, to apply to a German university. It defied me. I did not understand this. How this was done. They tried to make it really hard. And, in the end, it was much easier to get to a really good British university than it would get to into a German university. That was okay, but it's not like, as you said, German universities are no longer, they're good but not great, and they're playing hard to get when they shouldn't.
I'm jealous of you being in Italy. I like to joke that the most German thing about me is my love of Italy, so we have that in common, evidently. On comparative European bureaucracies, I used to believe that Italy bureaucracy is a complete mess. Literally, to get a sheet of paper, you need another sheet of paper, you need to get another sheet of paper, you need to get another sheet of paper, and to get that one, you need to get the first sheet of paper, so it's logically impossible. But you find one bureaucrat who takes a liking to you because you explain the plight to them and you make a nice joke, and they just stamp the paper for you. Germany, nobody will ever do that. It is completely rigid, but it is, or at least used to be, a reasonably logical system. So you can get it done. It just involves sort of a lot of work and a lot of pain. France, I used to say, was the worst of them because they were as inflexible as the Germans and as illogical as the Italians. But I actually wonder whether France has somewhat improved, or perhaps I was overly unkind in my perception of France in the past. But let's make sure
things have changed in France. They've gotten a lot better, and they've gotten a lot worse in Germany. So they have really changed, but it used to be like that.
That's my sense as well. This is a different topic, but I've spent a little bit of time in France recently, and I was actually impressed with how France has changed. It feels to me that whereas 20 years ago, Germany was dealing with the problems it had then and felt like it was capable of approaching the modern world, and its economic model seemed like it could work, France at that time felt really stagnant and still rooted in nostalgia for its past as a grande nation, just incapable of recognizing the status it now has in the world. And I think France has worked through some of that in a way that surprised me. And though it has fiscal challenges and some economic challenges, it doesn't feel to me in France as though the basic economic model of a country is unsustainable or is in need of radical reform in the way that is true in Germany. But I want to get back to the party political questions, right? So we invoked a little bit of this, and I just want to make sure that we do this systematically. There's an election coming up on February 23rd, 2025. As you explained and evoked, the basic party system in Germany is that there is, for the last few decades, 4 centrist political parties. 2 on the center right, the Christian Democrats, which we sometimes call the conservatives as well. That is the party of Angela Merkel. That is the party for whom Friedrich Merz, who was mentioned earlier, is now running for chancellor and, according to current polls, likely to become the next chancellor. And then there's the smaller center-right party, the Liberals, the Free Democrats, that claim both to be a philosophically liberal party and a party that is in favor of free enterprise. As you alluded to, often in practice, it ended up being much more a party that represents the interest of business or the interests of certain kind of relatively well-off social milieus without always standing up for the attractive principles which it claims to represent. And then there's 2 parties on the center-left, the Social Democrats, which is the sort of big traditional social democratic party, in Germany, but that has had significantly declining vote shares for a long time, as well as the Green Party, a newer party that has taken a lot of the left-wing voters that are more affluent, more educated in bigger towns, etc. Then there is a left party that is, in some complicated sense, the successor party to the SED, the Communist Party that ruled in East Germany. For that is now declining. There will potentially, in this new parliament, be a kind of split off from that party led by a politician called Sarah Wagenknecht, who is economically left-wing but is on social issues more conservative or in some senses populist. And then, of course, there's the AfD, the upstart right-wing populist party endorsed recently by Elon Musk, that had its roots in sort of economics professors who were worried about the single currency and the euro, but that, unlike other right-wing populist parties in Europe, has undergone a very different trajectory. Whereas most of those parties started on the far right, when you think of something like the Sweden Democrats, literally in the milieu of neo-Nazis, and then moderated over the course of decades, the AfD started as a kind of bourgeois, conservative, quite intellectual party, and has been drifting further and further to the right, with its leaders sort of pushed by more extreme leaders at each stage of the party's evolution. Now, basically, as you were saying earlier, I thought it was a very nice description, there's a sort of game of musical chairs between the main German political parties. During Angela Merkel's rule, she ruled at some point with the Free Democrats, the most natural coalition because we're both center-right parties. Then after a new election, she was she led a grand coalition with the Social Democrats. Then at the last election, the Social Democrats surprisingly came top. They didn't have a coherent majority on the center-left, so they ended up in what was called a traffic light coalition, the red Social Democrats, the Green Party, and the traditionally yellow Free Democrats from the center-right. That was unstable. It was not ideologically very coherent. The government founded both on its internal contradictions and on some genuine mistakes. And the party split apart, necessitating these new elections. Wolfgang, if you disagree with any of that, please let me know.
No, that was a very good,
What what
good
is
description of German politics.
Thank you. What is the outlook now as we're coming into these elections? Who do you think is going to win? Does it matter who is going to win? Which of the parties is left out on the musical chairs? Or, effectively, is any of these governments going to look the same to each other? How big do you think the danger is that the AfD poses in the short run in these upcoming elections, and in the longer run? You seem to evoke the possibility that the AfD may one day lead a German government. Tell us a little bit about, sort of beyond my description, how we should think about the stakes here.
Yeah, I mean there is a bit of uncertainty because there are three parties of those that you mentioned whose fate is extremely uncertain. There's one is the FDP, the Liberals, the Left Party, and the Wagenknecht, the Sarah Wagenknecht split-off Left Party. They're all polling around 5%, plus minus 1%, but that's too close to call within any sort of error margins of polling, especially when the numbers are that small. They could all be in or they could all be out, or some in, some out.
And that's relevant just to American listeners because in Germany, with in the particular German system of proportional representation, you need to get 5% of a vote nationally in order to be represented in parliament, except in certain complicated circumstances.
Yes, and that will affect the outcome, because if the FDP gets out and say they get 4.9%, and these are 4.9% of conservative votes that are lost to the conservatives basically, and if they get 5%, then they get all of the 5%, as part of a conservative camp. So there are sort of binary switches in this electoral system that, even though it's proportional, there is a bit of uncertainty about the eventual coalition building. But it is not possible to form a coalition against Friedrich Merz. So he will almost surely be the chancellor, unless he tanks. I remember in the last German election, the CDU at this time of the campaign, like 6 weeks before, were also leading the polls by a fairly large margin, but they kind of tanked in the last because of mistakes, because of infighting. The CDU is much more professional, and Merz is much more professional. So I don't expect this to happen, but you can't exclude it. Now he would if the current polling is correct, he has only one coalition option, which is the SPD. So you would get what is called in Germany a grand coalition. This is basically a language based from the times when they were the grand parties. They were the parties that had 40% each of the electoral support. And think of it as a coalition between the Republicans and the Democrats. It's hard to think, or the Tories and Labour in the UK. Very hard to imagine this in those countries. But that's basically what a grand coalition is in Germany. And we could end up with this sort of with a centrist grand coalition where the Greens would be the main opposition party, and it would not be one wouldn't count on this coalition to do much different from what the current government does, and it's hard to think of anyone doing something fundamentally different. I mean, if Friedrich Merz has a choice of coalition partners, say he has a choice between the Greens and the SPD, and say he goes for the Greens. Now, he would get a slightly different mix. The Greens might be more open to some of his sort of tax policies, and they might support him on Ukraine. That's quite an important issue, because Scholz and the SPD has been pretty much a very reluctant supporter of Ukraine. I mean, Scholz only this week blocked another 3 billion of aid to Ukraine that his foreign minister and his defense minister have actually demanded. So Scholz has been playing a double game on Ukraine, pretending he supports Ukraine, but kind of behind the scenes trying to prevent significant German deliveries and frustrating the process all the way, and trying to play to the left, especially now that we have an election, play to the left in Germany. There's a significant part of the German electorate that does not want Germany to support Ukraine. So this is a game he's been playing. That would be difficult for Merz if he went into a coalition. And here's another thing: if Trump gets to power, and if Trump were to impose a peace deal, say on Ukraine and Russia, impose or facilitate one, or negotiate one, The new government in Germany will not be in office until probably May or June or July, depending on how long the coalition talks take. By that time, the war in Ukraine might be over. And by that time, the considerations for the coalition might be a very different one. My hunch is that the CDU and the CSU in particular, that they prefer the SPD because they're the kind of the devils they know. They're kind of the people with whom they've done business before. The Greens have been responsible for the phase out of nuclear. They've done a lot of things that are really irksome to the center-right, like the domestic heating bill and a lot of green legislation that has just come into pass. And the business elites, especially the Bavarians, they just hate this stuff. And so there is almost an emotional reaction against them. So my hunch is it would be pretty much another sort of Merkel-type coalition with Merz. Merz also, when you listen to him now...
And tell us a little bit about Friedrich Merz, because, as you're saying, he is, as we're recording it, pretty to very likely to be the next Chancellor of Germany. I don't think that he is a figure that's very well known in the United States. He's, quite well known to American policymakers because he's been in German politics for a long time, and he took a number of relatively senior economic positions in Germany. So I think the American business community knows him reasonably as well from his time in the political wilderness after he had a political falling out with Angela Merkel, who kind of bested him in an internal power struggle. But I don't think that the average listener to this podcast will know that much about Friedrich Merz. So tell us a little bit about who he is, because I think in terms of his political outlook, in terms of his character, he is quite different from Angela Merkel, even if the kind of government he might end up leading might end up being surprisingly similar.
Oh, absolutely. But we should also remember that the young Angela Merkel was very different from the later Angela Merkel. And it's a bit like with Merz as well. He was a firebrand on the right of the party, deeply conservative. He comes from a very conservative region of Germany, the Sauerland, which is a hilly region in Westphalia. He is, he has a long voting record on conservative legislation. But nowadays, now that he, looks pretty certain to become chancellor, he talks, he's sort of lost some of his rhetoric. He's a very sharp orator, and he lost some of the rhetoric, and he's behaving more sort of presidential, he talks like a chancellor already, and that's actually a bad sign because if you want change, you want actually somebody who says, look, he could say, look, we want to get rid of the citizens' income, which is a massively ambitious social program that the current government has launched, and hugely expensive. Now, he could say we want to get rid of the citizens' income. We want to get defense spending up to 3% of GDP. And we want to, reduce taxes. We want to do this and that. And this is the condition on which I will go into a government. And I'm not going to form a coalition with anybody who does not accept that. He's not going to do that. He's already moderating his demands because he knows he needs to cut a deal. This is telling us that the deal is the essence of what this is about, not the fundamental policy itself. So the hugely ambitious policy proposal is pretty much for the birds. Now, Merz is he's one of the sort of great transatlanticists, and there's lots of transatlantic organizations in Germany. One is called the Atlantic Brücke, which was an organization of German. I was a member of it at one point. So a transatlantic friendship society with Americans and Germans, and it was he worked at BlackRock in Germany. He was I think he was the chairman of the supervisory board. Or a director, I'm not so sure, but he was certainly had a senior position at BlackRock in Germany. So he is aware of American capitalism more than probably any German politician before, but he's not talking much about it. He's still, as he's just said this week, he thinks the German model is fine. It just needs to be managed differently. And so he is pretty much. I would still consider him, despite his sort of American links, I would still consider him very much deeply steeped in German conservatism, unlikely to be, to do brave things. He thinks he can cut a trade deal with Donald Trump. I think good luck with him. Good luck for him with this, because Trump is not the sort of trade deal kind of president. But Merz thinks that he's got the skills and the charm or whatever it is to get to Trump. We'll see. We'll see what will come of that. Because the goal of his policy is to maintain the trade surpluses, to go back to the trade surpluses. You talk about export Weltmeister, is export world champion, which is ridiculous. It's a fake category. You don't want to be export world champion. This is like, you want to be, you want to create welfare, you want to create employment, you want to create stability, you want to create, hope. There are many valid economic goals to have, but the export world champion is a real fake category. I mean, you're celebrating an imbalance, basically, a global, part, your contribution to global imbalances. There's nothing to be celebrated. And this is not good exports. Exporting is a fantastic thing. The Germans have a surplus of exports. They're not importing enough. They're not investing enough. These are the things that the Germans are lacking as a society, as a country. And I have not seen much in Merz's proposal, except for maybe a cut in corporation tax, which might lead to a small increase in inwards. I don't think it will actually have that much of an impact. Because it's not the tax that cuts. It's the way business is done. As you said yourself, same, by the way, it was for me when I grew up in Germany. None of us thought of becoming an entrepreneur. Nobody in my school class did, at university, nobody did. That was, by the way, different in the 50s. There was a very entrepreneurial decade. There was a very brief period after the Second World War when this was entrepreneurial, because they didn't have big companies. So if you didn't do it, no one would do. So you did it, and there wasn't a job that you had to go to, because you had to find your own way. So this was a different society. Germany in the early 50s was much more American than sort of Germany at any other time. I say sort of the 50s, maybe until the mid 60s. Germany had many characteristics, more characteristic of the United States than at any time. It developed in a very different direction afterwards.
Finally, to round off the sort of political round robin, tell us about the AfD, how you think its influence in German politics is going to evolve, and how worried we should be about it. There was this debate when Elon Musk threw his support behind the AfD. I wrote an article saying, yes, Elon, the AfD is far right, which not all of my readers appreciated. In part, I think, because they are looking at somebody like Giorgia Meloni in Italy, who was made out to be a fascist in the pages of the New York Times, who obviously does have roots in fascist politics, but who's turned out to be a politician with whom I have significant disagreement, but who certainly does not appear to be taking Italy in any fascist direction, in part because I think there is a good argument to be made that something like Marine Le Pen has moderated over the course of the last years, has quite deliberately expelled her own father, who now passed away, from her political party in order to signal that kind of distance. And so I think it's easy to impose the same kind of frame on the AfD. But as we were saying earlier, I think both the history of the AfD and perhaps its nature is quite different. It's notable that Marine Le Pen cut her ties with the AfD in the run-up to the European Parliament election. So how do you see the AfD? One of your criticisms earlier was interesting, that it's too conservative rather than that it's too radical, that on economic policy it actually is full of nostalgia for the kind of Germany that's lost, perhaps understandably, but unrealistically trying to get the country back to that. How dangerous do you think the AfD is, and why do you seem to think, based on what you were saying earlier, that though it is currently isolated in the political landscape in Germany, it may come to play a significant role, perhaps even in government, within the next years?
Yeah, I mean, the AfD wants to leave the EU. It wants to leave NATO. It wants to get Germany out of all international treaties. So that's a pretty radical position, much more radical than what Le Pen is. Le Pen does not want to leave the EU, not anymore. She did at one point. Now, as you also said, the AfD started as a party of conservative professors, much more libertarian. It was much more of a right, conservative libertarian party. and it moved towards a nationalist party. And its main theme these days is immigration. And its policies on immigration is very similar to those of Trump. She wants to get people out, including people who got German passports on mistaken or fraudulent pretexts. So there is a very significant push for not only stopping immigration, but actually to get people out. So this on the radical end of the immigration, on the immigration debate. It has absolutely nothing to do with any of the themes we discussed. The AfD is not interested in entrepreneurship. There's nothing entrepreneurial about it. There's nothing in the culture of this. They're not Nazis. There are some Nazis amongst them, I would say, but the leadership are not Nazis. They are on the right. Can't call it the far right. Wouldn't have a problem with that. Because it's just a geographical description, but it is certainly in the political sense of Germany, certainly outside of the consensus, but inside, I would say, inside of sort of constitutional legality. It doesn't try to break laws, or it doesn't advocate the breach of laws. It tries very deliberately to stay within the laws, but it has characters around the leadership, not in the leadership, but around the leadership, that are very, very shady and dodgy. In the European parliamentary elections a year ago, it was led by a guy who employed, as it turned out, a Chinese spy in his staff. The party is full of spooks and full of people with very shady connections with Russia and China. And there are parties, and there are some prominent politicians of the party who constantly get sued or dragged in front of courts because they have used some Nazi symbols in one of their speeches, which is illegal in Germany. So this is something that hangs over the party. And the guy is coming back to this European election. The reason why Le Pen, you mentioned that she cut off the ties with the AfD, is that this party tried to mitigate the importance of the SS and plead for understanding of some of the work that some of the SSS people have, the good work apparently that some of the SSS people had done. That was too much for Le Pen, and she said, "I don't want to have anything to do with these Nazis." There is obviously, we have to remember, the nationalists in Europe, they don't only hate the center. The nationalists in Europe hate each other. It's the nature of extreme nationalism, of German and French nationalism, not to like the nationalists of the other side. These are not fundamental, even though they're all organized in European groups, they're not fundamentally European. They don't care very much about the EU. But they're not stupid. I mean, Alice Weidel, who was just interviewed by Elon Musk, I mean, she's a PhD in economics. She's a fluent speaker of Mandarin. She's worked as a consultant. So she is certainly educated, probably more educated than the vast majority of politicians in the CDU, SPD, or the Green Party, in terms of her sort of general understanding of international affairs. So these people are not stupid, and I would expect the AfD to evolve in a very similar way to the way the Le Pen's evolved. That they will, from where they are, probably become. They will realize that in order to get into government, they will need to moderate a little bit. They will certainly need to contain the extremes and really expel these people, and then come to positions where there would be still significant disagreement, but where it was very clear that they could form a coalition with the CDU maybe at one point. And I would expect that to happen in about 4 years.
That's interesting, and I made a somewhat similar point in my article. I mean, when you look at the polls right now, they predict that the AfD is going to get between 18 and 21% of the vote. It may end up being a little bit less or a little bit more than that. That is a very significant chunk of the German electorate, and it's much higher than any similarly radical party has gotten in German politics since the founding of the Federal Republic. But it is significantly lower than equivalent parties or right-wing populist parties in other parts of Europe. And I think the reason for that is not any kind of German exceptionalism. It is that the AfD has so far been less good at cutting its ties from the most unsavory elements within its party than for example, Marine Le Pen has in France. And so I think its electoral interest lies in that direction. Now, as we've been discussing throughout this conversation, the fact that your interest lies in some direction doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be smart enough and have the agency to actually move in that direction. But it's at least a good first approximation of what may happen. I realize we've been talking a lot about Germany, and I've really enjoyed this detailed primer of Germany. But you are somebody who also has thought a lot about Europe and the European Union. Your publication is called Eurointelligence, not Germany Intelligence. So I just want to close the conversation by asking you a little bit about the state of Europe, perhaps starting with the state of the euro. As you evoked earlier, you were one of the most prominent critics of Germany's policy throughout the euro crisis, warning that its unwillingness to move towards more political union and to find a solution for southern European countries that would allow them to grow and to innovate would prove to be a disaster. I guess there's two ways of looking at that now. Somebody could make the devil's advocate argument that there was real pain in Greece and Spain and so on, but those countries actually have come out of the euro crisis surprisingly well. That Greece now has significant economic growth, that Italy is actually one of the more dynamic big economies within the European Union right now, that perhaps the wait-and-see approach that Angela Merkel and other politicians imposed on the European Union sort of worked. We didn't have a painful breaking apart of the euro. There was no economic cataclysm. And strangely enough, the southern European countries now seem to be among those within Europe doing comparatively well. I assume you don't fully, and perhaps not at all, agree with that point of view. Why is that optimistic reading wrong-headed?
Yeah, okay, no, you're right that I don't agree, because if I look at Italy, is not dynamic. Italy, is flexible. This is more of a national character issue than an economic system issue. I would not characterize the Italian economy as performing very well. If you look at the IMF's 5-year ahead forecast, which is sort of their estimate of potential growth, it has Italy at 0.7% in 2029 and Germany at the same level. So Germany and Italy are pretty much the growth laggards in Europe with very little, this is up sub 1% growth levels. Greece is indeed much better. But it's always hard to, small countries can adjust in a way that large countries cannot, and this is what happened in Greece. It was an incredibly brutal adjustment. Greek society is very, very toxic. This has left big traces. The Greek hatred for Germany in some parts is just very, very strong. This is not a country that is, on which Germany can rely on force or support or friendship. Ireland and Spain are different. Ireland had a crisis, but Ireland was always very sort of dexterous. Ireland had a classic financial crisis, and the way this was handled was actually not bad. I think for Ireland, there was no need for a bailout, or the program that Ireland had was perfectly sensible. It stabilized the financial sector, and Ireland has done very well. And the same for Spain. Spain didn't get a full bailout. Spain only got a financial bailout. And, once the banking system, because Spain had a housing crisis, Spain didn't have a fundamental, the fiscal policy of Spain were actually fine. It was the banking system that got hit by a mortgage bubble, as similar to the United States, and Spain was not strong enough to sustain it. So they got a bailout on this. They paid everything back. They got out early. So the thing was actually a success. And the flexibility of Spain is very much not due to this bailout. It's to do with domestic policy decisions that two consecutive governments of the right and the left took over a long period of time. There's a high degree of consensus in Spain on at least how the economy functions. Not a high degree of consensus on how the country functions, but at least Spain is for the time being a very healthy economy. It still rests very much on immigration and employment growth, not so much on productivity growth. But compared to Germany and others, Spain is sort of the light in the eurozone. The problem in the eurozone is that we've kind of grown apart, and if you see, for example, you get a financial crisis in France, which is a possibility, depending on how this turns out there. The eurozone crisis could be back at any time, and the political willingness to solve it is not there. There's absolutely nobody in the eurozone will want a fiscal union anymore. The kind of stuff that I used to bang on about, in column after column, talk about fiscal union, talk about these solutions. Nobody wants this anymore. So it's basically a monetary union that will not be a fiscal union. That wasn't clear back 10 years ago. It was a monetary union that may become a fiscal union, but it may not. Today we know it won't. And we are far more likely to grow apart with. And I think the more important thing about Meloni is that she's close to Trump, not so much that she is a fascist. She is not a fascist. She is a conservative who is very much in the Trump-Musk camp, and Trump and Musk are splitting the Europeans. This is already happening, and Meloni will be the leading one on the American side. That's America. A very smart way for Italy to get out of it, to be the junior partner in that relationship.
That's interesting. And she has played her cards very well. I mean, this is a different conversation, but it is interesting.
She is, yeah. She is one of the most formidable European leaders. Yeah.
Explain to people who didn't follow that debate a decade ago or who need a refresher on it, why it is fundamentally a problem to have a monetary union without having a fiscal union. Why do you think that the basic structural defect of a eurozone remains in place in a way that is kind of less relevant and a little bit hidden in a moment of economic boom? Even for Europe, is not going through an economic boom. All the world economy is in reasonably good shape. And why at any moment of crisis that structural defect is going to become a significant problem again?
Yeah, I mean, a monetary union that isn't a fiscal union and that will never be a fiscal union. That's where we are. It's essentially a fixed exchange rate system. We have the same currency and we have the same policy arrangement, but ultimately, economically, it's not that fundamentally different to a fixed exchange rate system. In the past, they all broke up, and eventually, countries have an interest to leave. For example, if there's a bailout, if there's inflation, any member state can say, "Look, if we leave, we can do better." If the ECB doesn't get in control of the inflation, it's still above 2%. They haven't had their target in 5 years. If they don't meet their target in the next 5 years, I could well imagine a Northern European country, say Germany even, to say, look, we can do better than that. And actually they could. It wouldn't be that hard. It could have been, Greece was almost left the Eurozone, and the Eurozone would have collapsed had Greece left. There would have been all sorts of defaults, internal defaults, payment systems defaults happening when that happens. The system is not geared for anyone leaving. That's why people put so much pressure on everybody to stick together. But it just takes one election in one of the 21 members, or however we are now, to cause a sort of a mighty accident. Now, you want a fiscal union in order to have, or political union, which is part of the same thing, basically. You want a fiscal union in order to basically, prevent that from happening. You want to have a system, a lender of last resort. You want to, imagine the United States, Fed and Treasury were separate or hostile to one another. These organizations are, the Fed is independent, but it's part of the state. It's not, it's not outside your jurisdiction, and they need to work together over longer periods of time. Obviously, you can always create some structures. You can create, from the toolkit of structural finance, you can always create some strange instruments that fix some problems that you have, some technical problems that you have, but you can never fix the political problem that there isn't a fundamental solidarity in the Eurozone, that when things go really wrong, and that it can go wrong in so many different ways, sovereign debt crisis is actually not the most likely cause for a breakup. It's much more to do with economic differentials and war and geopolitical realignment. When people say it no longer makes sense for us to be in this monetary union, we'd rather be in someone else's monetary union.
What does that tell us about the state of the European Union as a whole? I mean, I'm struck by the fact that certainly you're a few years older than I am. When your generation was thinking about the European Union, it was a very idealistic project. Even when I was growing up, there was still a sense of the nobility of a European project based in part on the contrast between its aspirations and what the relatively recent European past has been, and on the hope that we might create a general sense of European political and to some extent cultural identity, which would surpass some of the national differences between European identities. I think that this is gone. The weight of the past has receded, rightly or not, as World War II becomes a more and more distant memory. While I think many people living in Germany and France and Italy and Greece and Spain have generally warm feelings towards other European countries, probably are much more interconnected with those European countries than they might have been a few generations ago, perhaps have spent a term studying abroad as part of the Erasmus program, probably have holidayed in various other European countries. I don't think anybody really expects at this point or particularly desires for us to surpass national identities in such a way that the European identity becomes primary. That does not seem to be in this political moment either particularly likely or part of the political language of aspiration of mainstream political parties in really any of those countries. But without those hopes, without that telos, without the sort of imagined endpoint of this, a lot of the European Union seems quite illegitimate because it does have a lot of power, in part because of the euro, in part just because of all kinds of competencies that are now concentrated in Brussels. But people pay very little attention to what the European Parliament does, and they have quite little control over what the European Commission does. So is the crisis that you've diagnosed relating to the single currency not just as strong and just as deep relating to the union as a whole?
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with your characterization of the state of modern Europe. I remember when I started to write about European economics as a journalist, as a young journalist in the mid-1980s. And, this was the time when they started to think about the single currency. There was already the first decisions taken in the European Council. Central bankers got together to draft up had some ideas. The law committee met. Then came the entire Maastricht Treaty and the process that followed. This was the high period of European integration. Germany and France had, exchanged ministers. They had joint cabinet meetings. There were Franco-German friendship societies. Brussels was a bustling place of national and European politicians. People like me, we had, my family, we led a sort of very European life. I mean, it was the euro that started in 1999 and Schengen started sort of to expand around that time, passport-free travel in Europe. And you could, for the first time, we lived in kind of 4 countries simultaneously. We had family in Germany, we lived in Belgium, we had a house in Italy, and we spent considerable time in France as well. So we basically, roamed an entire region of Europe that was split in 4 countries and 2 sort of transit countries to get through them and between them. And that was suddenly possible. And, it felt a bit like, living in Europe felt a bit like living in the United States. You had a currency, you had freedom of movement. You had, there were differences. Europe was in some respects poorer. It was not as well organized and people had different attitudes, but it had a certain sense as the beginning of something. And that completely, I think it was around the Barroso Commission president when this whole thing deflated. They suddenly, after the introduction of the euro, they were no longer interested. The whole subject of monetary integration, fiscal integration completely collapsed. They were talking about there was the Lisbon agenda at the time. This was all about becoming competitive. So we all sort of took on the German thing about competitiveness, cost competitiveness. This was all the whole thing went in that direction. Then came enlargement that brought its own issues and also very different perspectives. Since many of those new countries, especially Poland and Hungary, didn't join the euro. So they were not interested in developing this issue at all, and they had other issues. And then obviously with Angela Merkel, she was not interested in the Eurozone. She was mostly interested in Central and Eastern Europe and, getting the East and West to work together. And that succeeded to some extent. And obviously she also played a crucial role in getting Syrian immigrants to Germany after the start of the Syrian civil war and the refugee wave from 2015. So the whole thing got derailed, but at the same time, you're absolutely right. The Commission became more powerful, and what they did and said, the EU always finds something to do. You have as a large organization, and they would not become a political union. That was clear. So they became a regulatory union, and the word in Brussels was, we control the world through regulation. We are the world's regulator. And then they did this with AI and they did this with crypto, but they didn't have any companies. They had no skin in the game. And here is the European Union becoming very bureaucratic because suddenly regulation was no longer, as it used to be, influenced by the companies that wanted light regulation, but it was influenced by consumers who wanted tough regulation. So the whole social network regulation is based on protecting viewers and consumers and users.
Let's be clear. I mean, these are associations claiming to speak for consumers. I don't know that the average European consumer wants a cookie infrastructure where every time you navigate to a new website, you have to, click something to tell them what cookies they can keep or not.
That was the most absurd. The cookie was the most absurd invention of the Europeans and kind of burdened the entire world with this. Make the internet almost unusable. If it wasn't for some cookie cutters software, we would be completely hopeless in the internet. But this is very European, and this has gone on in AI and crypto. You wouldn't want to set up an AI company in Europe. There are too many restrictions. It's not a place where you could do this. And the EU has therefore developed in a very unfortunate direction. Rather than becoming a superpower, it became a super regulator. And now with Ukraine, it tries to reinvent itself as a superpower, only to realize that its budget, it has no money, it has no power. Foreign policy decisions have to be taken by unanimity, and Viktor Orban and other leaders of the far right hold the EU to ransom over pretty much all foreign policy decisions, and extract money out of the EU for any commitment they give. So the whole thing isn't working. I think the EU made a number of big strategic errors. And I've always come back to that moment in the, 99 when they basically abandoned the fiscal union. That was sort of the moment when, a fiscal union would have been necessary for a banking union. And the banking union would have been necessary for a capital markets union. And the capital markets union would have been necessary for an upstart, for a startup culture. Because that isn't going to happen through Landesbanken and Sparkassen. You need capital markets. So there's a whole chain of events that is kind of behind the fact that we had this discussion on the German economy. And the European there could have been a European solution to this German problem. In fact, to the European one, but we didn't go down this road. And I don't think there can be a German solution or a national solution to this.
So my last question for you, what is the upshot of this? You can argue that if we'd gotten the fiscal union, we would have gotten these other steps of integration, and perhaps that would have taken the European project in a very different direction, and perhaps they might have been able to generate the enthusiasm and the sense of a European project that would have kept that spirit you described from the 1990s going. I personally, I think, agree with you on much of what you've written about the crisis, the solution to the euro crisis and the ongoing structural problems of the euro. I think I'm a little bit more skeptical that these steps would have been able to generate and prolong that kind of enthusiasm. But in a way, that's a moot debate, because as you're pointing out, we're now not getting a fiscal union. We're not getting all of these other transformations of the European Union. It is, for the moment, continuing to see itself somewhat absurdly as a regulatory superpower more than anything else. In that case, is the solution to take some powers back from Europe to the national state, where there is a sense of political identity and accountability that can actually make sure this power is wielded in a productive direction? Is it to hope that we can completely reinvent the European project at some point, perhaps after the single currency inevitably collapses, as you imply? But that would be a kind of accelerationism that I know you're not particularly friendly to from other parts of the conversation. I mean, are we just stuck with a European Union that, like the German economy, continues to just deteriorate and stagnate, and that's the best we can hope for the next generation?
I don't think things work like that. So I don't think renationalization is a desirable nor possible. The one thing that's further more difficult than European integration is actually to sort of a controlled disintegration, because you need majorities for that, and that you will never get those majorities for that. But what I can imagine, and here we go to your accelerationist perspective, I can imagine, I think, European integration will ultimately happen in a serious way, but it will probably not be the EU that does this. It will probably be some post-EU format. I think there is a possibility that the EU fails, and that there is some kind of a, more or less violent breakup. Some countries saying that's enough. Britain is gone. It didn't lead to other countries following, because Britain didn't handle it so well. But the situation could be that a country let's say a northern European country says, look, this Brussels regulation on tech industries is ridiculous. If we left Brussels, we could do better. The single market is all about widgets, all about goods, about old-fashioned cars and stuff like that. We don't need this. We can import Chinese cars tariff-free, and have cheaper and better cars than anything we get from Europe, and we can sell our software internationally, and we make a lot more money. And we don't need these tariffs and all these regulations. It becomes rational to leave the EU. That was never the case before. It was only the crazies who wanted to leave the EU. Now the worse the EU gets, the more rational it becomes to leave it. I don't think we're at this point yet, but we could be in the Eurozone at this point, as I explained. There may be at one point somebody can outperform the ECB, and someone can outperform the single market. And the single market is only traded goods; it's not services. It's only a minority of services in the single market, and all the growth in the economy is in services. In areas of the services sector that are not covered by the single market. So it's very hard to predict this. These things can take all sorts of turns. There could be suddenly a new generation of leaders who rediscover the spirit of the 1980s and 1990s and suddenly do it from inside the EU. There could be fortuitous circumstances, sort of like a spark, and everything sort of falls into place. But this is the EU of 27, and the political affiliations of those leaders and their political views have actually diverged over the years. They're more divergent today than they were 5 years ago, and more divergent 5 years ago than they were 15 years ago. So I conclude that this project is unsustainable, and the unsustainable ends at some point. And the question is how it ends and what will happen. But it could well be that some countries will leave and then discover that they would like to recreate it, but not in the way it was done, but properly. And having national currencies make no sense. A Deutschmark or a franc, that wasn't a happy situation. The entities are too small. They would get squeezed. So they would probably want to have something like a joint currency, and they would probably agree a fiscal union and not go through that chaos that they went before. And I think that would then become. But again, it will all depend on what kind of political leaders you have. And we should not forget, if you're rich, you can stagnate for a very, very long time. UK stagnated for a very long time. Didn't continue to stagnate, but there was a long period of stasis in the UK's economic performance, and people were always saying, "Oh yeah, we're great decliners," and people almost took pride in their decline as sort of a cultural thing. In the early 80s, people were still sort of on decline, on a sort of decline trip. until sort of Thatcher changed attitudes, and suddenly Britain was the go-to country, and the country that was moving. Something like that can change, and Germany is probably not happy, and Europe is probably not happy to be declining forever. But the resistance to the resistance is significant, and it's not policy stuff anymore. This is I think this is a state failure, not just a failure of the German state, but a failure of the European state, basically. And that is sort of something that is harder to fix, and it is ultimately likely to create much more sort of a rupture, much more sort of radical shifts than we would like to imagine, or we would like to discuss in polite company. That's something you would not generally find a lot of people nodding their approval of, because it has a certain revolutionary quality to it, but it's very hard to predict.
Wolfgang, thank you so much for spending this time with us.
Yascha, thank you for inviting me.